Hello, EJ and Richard. Thank you on behalf of Access Cultura and also personally for joining us today. It's a real honor to be speaking with you about what it means to build trans-inclusive cultural spaces. My name is Laura Falésia. I use she, her pronouns, and my PhD research focuses on LGBTQ belonging in organizational contexts. So this conversation also connects with my own work and my own research questions. We are living through a difficult moment for us as queer people. So, for me, being able to speak about these themes with people who already understand why this matters is really deeply reassuring. To begin, could each of you briefly introduce yourselves and your relationship with your own work, please? EJ, yeah, you can start.
Hello, my name's EJ. I use the pronouns he, they, and I'm the curator of the Museum of Transology, a senior lecturer in culture criticism and curation at Central St. Martin's at the University of Arts London, and was fortunate enough to be invited to co-author the Trans Inclusive Culture Guidance with Richard Sandell.
Richard, go
Hi.
on.
Hi, everyone. And thanks, Laura. It's great to be here. My name's Richard Sandell. My pronouns are he, him. I'm one of the two co-directors of our CMG. We are the Research Centre for Museums and Galleries. We're part of Museum Studies at the University of Leicester, and we do what we call collaborative action research with a whole range of cultural partners advancing different forms of equity and inclusion.
Thank you. EJ, I have a very specific curiosity regarding the museum. So it began with a very personal act of saving objects that traditional museums might have overlooked. At what moment did you realize this was the beginning of a museum and not just your personal collection?
The museum objects that I started saving were personal, as and in particular the artifacts that were in my hospital room and actually my surgical artifacts from trans positive gender surgery. But the year that I underwent that surgery, I was also working with the National Trust, and I was becoming really quite obsessed with this idea of freezing rooms in time, which is one of the key approaches of preserving heritage buildings in the United Kingdom. You walk into the house and you see the dining room set up, and you think, oh, this is where the family was. So I was really interested in that as a museum technology. And it then this experience also coincided, and my colleague Richard has done work specifically on this with what we call the trans tipping point. And this is when the media particularly had this huge explosion in attention that it paid towards trans people. But in the position I was sitting, where I was both a curator and a trans person, and experiencing a huge monumental moment in my life that I felt I wanted to record and archive for myself, these three things, collided, if you like, and it brought me to this realization that actually the personal is the museum, and what trans people are missing is this opportunity to save ourselves in moments of time that are hugely significant, and to use material culture to talk about our experiences for us. And these collisions basically brought me to this moment that was the Museum of Transology.
So when you receive objects and personal stories from other trans people, how do you decide which pieces to display, how to display them? How do you make decisions regarding those objects?
We have a bit of a saying that the collecting policy for the Museum of Transology is that we don't have a collecting policy. The idea being that we interrupt the curatorial hierarchy by saying that everyone is the curator of their own gender story. And therefore, because they have that authority, because they have the authority to author their own stories. In fact, they choose the object. And so it's led to a number of really quite profound curatorial happenings in what I now call transing the archive. And one of those is that a lot of people donate objects that they know already exist within the collection.
Mm.
And so when we think about that, most museums don't have the space to collect multiple objects of the same thing from the same period, made of the same materials. And indeed, if a cisgender curator before the Museum of Transology was thinking, oh, I want to be trans inclusive, I'm going to collect an object, here's a box of hormones. Some people take trans, some trans people take hormones, and that would be the narrative. In actual fact, what we're seeing is that trans people are donating objects to be part of a wider trans story. They're donating to belong. They're donating to say, this is what I experience as well, and this is my perspective of that experience. So actually, this method of allowing the donor to author their own story and choose the object that goes in has actually contributed to a freedom to create narratives that usual curatorial hierarchies wouldn't have enabled.
And this is very empowering for trans people either, because I'm thinking now that if I saw an object that I already have at home, I might feel, like you said, I belong to that space, I belong to the museum, and I belong to a community. And that's very cool. Yeah. Richard, I'd like to know, since you are not a trans person, um, what have you learned from the Museum of Transology that you could never have learned through interviews or traditional academic research methods alone?
It's a really great question. I've learned a huge amount. The whole premise of the work we do in the research centre is that it's collaborative and we blend together different forms of expertise, and lived and professional expertise is always part of that mix, and that comes alongside other forms of expertise from the museum we're working with, from our research team, and so on. And so blending those is always transformative. It always gets us to a different place. And it's brilliant hearing EJ reflect more about the Museum of Transology and those methods and those purposeful attempts to disrupt hierarchies, because there's a real synergy there. And I think in terms of how we're working, what do museums, what does heritage look like when you do disrupt those hierarchies and when you place trans perspectives, lives, experiences, worldviews at the heart of that process? So it's been a huge learning curve. I think, the way that museums have, and the way the trans stories were told around the time of that tipping point that EJ was referring to, was growing numbers of trans stories, growing a public awareness of trans lives, but nearly always narrated from a cisgender perspective, and rarely giving opportunities for that centering and prioritization of lived experience. That's what the Museum of Transology does, and it's what we have tried to push through our own collaborative work as well.
And do you feel that the museum is equally legible for cis and trans visitors, or is it in some ways queer coded or trans coded, if you want to think like this? For example, some objects may be immediately recognized by trans people, while cis visitors might not fully grasp their emotional or embodied meaning. If so, is this a problem? It's not a problem. How do you deal with this?
Do you want to take
Richard,
that
you
one?
can answer, yeah.
I'll go first.
Um,
You go first, DJ, and I'll follow up.
I think it's by us and about us and for us and for others. I think that what actually an everyday object does, which is largely the objects that we collect, is that they have a magic attached to them because they're recognizable. So I'll give you an example. We have a lipstick in the collection. It's an inexpensive lipstick. It wasn't bought at a luxury department store. It was bought at a pharmacy. It's scratched and it's battered and it's only got a tiny bit left in the bottom, and that tiny little bit is melted, right? This is not a lipstick that has an Yves Saint Laurent logo on it, right? It's a lipstick that's lived in the bottom of her handbag and she's left it there for too long and she's forgotten about it. Except she hasn't. This actually is a lipstick that was given to her by her sister, who was the first person to accept her transition. But to the cisgendered viewer who sees the lipstick on display, they immediately go, that's like the lipstick my sister has in the bottom of her handbag. And for that instant, they have something in common. And it's before they have an opportunity to go, trans woman shouldn't be wearing lipstick, if they are that kind of person who has those preconceived ideas because they haven't had an opportunity to meet a trans person and learn about them, and they're only listening to what the media tells them. For that moment, they've disrupted the ideas that trans people are different from them, and they've connected. And so actually the material culture gives us an opportunity, this everyday material culture gives us an opportunity to connect with people through lived experience by sharing our everyday lives.
Yeah, thank you. Richard, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I was just going to sort of follow up because I think EJ's covered that focus in the Museum of Transology, but EJ and I work with the team in other museums that are not museums of transology, and we look at where, how, and with what, to what ends trans objects and stories and lives are publicly presented. And there, because they are mainstream, they are public museums for that intend to be for everyone. We think about telling those trans stories in two ways that are affirming for trans people whose lives are often overlooked, misrepresented, and so on in the public realm. But in that exact same story, that exact same encounter, enriching and engaging for everyone. So there's a kind of something different going on to the Museum of Transology in some of the more regular, familiar, conventional museum structures that we're talking about as places for everyone. How can they do that work that is ethically informed, places trans narration and experience at the heart of that presentation, but does that in a way that works for all audiences and collectively addresses sort of, as EJ said, sort of negative or stereotypical or harmful narratives around trans people that circulate as well.
So the museum acts before the preconcepts arise. The museum acts like connects deeper with people before their preconceptions about trans people. That's what I'm understanding.
Yes, can I add as well? We've found that audiences, as well as all the museum staff that we've worked with, are thirsting for modern stories about gender experiences that are more, I mean, they're bored by their own cisgender stories. You know, like actually this adds richness and diversity to museums. This is exciting new ways of thinking about complicated ideas that people have a thirst for more knowledge about. They're yelling out for it. And what we find is that the staff want to present it and feel confident in the way that they present it, particularly through lived experience, but also by understanding what's embedded in the historical records about gender nonconformity. This isn't just information for trans people either. Trans people have friends and girlfriends and they have lovers, they have parents, they have families, they have neighbors. The trans kids at school have classmates. All of these people want to know that trans people are understood in society. So this becomes a bigger issue about what museums stand for and what they can achieve. And particularly, you know, where my work is placed here in the UK at a time of real social division and the uprising of populist ideas that are informed quite often by popular, you know, mainstream tabloid media. Actually, this gives us an opportunity to say, what kind of society do we want to be? What values do we hold dear? How do we want to treat other people that we may not know from firsthand experience about, but that we want to live alongside with in our communities in harmony, respectfully, and with understanding? And this is core to really why I started doing the work in the first instance. Museology and curation is a tool, it's a gift that we can use to better help us understand the world that we live in.
So that's the way you respond to people who feel that recognizing trans lives or names or histories limits their own freedom. That's how you respond to them.
Correct.
Yeah. So when we talk about trans inclusive culture, we are of course talking about preventing discrimination, but I think we are essentially talking about challenging institutional habits, institutional assumptions, institutional cultures, and forms of welcome, for instance. In your experience, Richard, are cultural institutions willing to do this work but unsure how to do it? Or you often feel that they still need to be convinced that this work matters?
There is a huge appetite to do this work in the cultural sector, and it's been really heartening to see so much interest from so many different kinds of museums, large, small, national, regional, all kinds of collection types that have come forward and want to work with us, want to take up the research and the guidance that we're developing and apply that. So phenomenally, that has been a really key, unequivocal feature of this work. At the same time, as you're sort of pointing to, there is uncertainty and there is a nervousness in the context that EJ outlined. And so that's the sort of space that we're working with. Cultural organizations, individual practitioners, almost without exception, are eager to take that work forward, but with support in solidarity as a group and in with the kind of assurances and the tools and strategies that our collaborative project can take forward.
Thank you. EJ, do you want to add something?
I think again, this has been for me the collision between the private and the public in my experiences, and this is often something that you know, anyone that works with lived experience within the sector has to navigate. And for me, it was so deeply heartening to see the warmth, the enthusiasm that people came to the Trans Inclusive Culture Project with from the sector, but also the commitment that they showed to understanding the work that we were presenting to them and then applying it within their own organizations. It wasn't lip service. They were coming along to literally get the tools they needed to do this work, and then they've gone away and they've done it. And when we did a review of the work that we've been doing over the last year recently, I was able to do an audit around the UK of museums that were currently or upcoming had trans content on show or on display, and it was from one end of the UK to the other. Absolutely, like there are just museums everywhere showing the most fantastic, the most well-informed, the most creative trans content, and equally there's been so much movement that, for example, at the Welcome Museum about to open is a show by Black trans artist Rudy Lowe. And Rudy's work for this exhibition is not about being trans. Their work is work as an artist exploring mental health of the Black communities within London, and it has some trans content in it. So we're getting to the stage where we can think about trans people being more complex than their gender identity, and the trans community contributing more to society than an idea about themselves.
Well, thank you, EJ and Richard, for this conversation. It has been a truly privilege to hear you speak about these cultural institutions and the work that you continue to develop in building trans-inclusive spaces. On behalf of Access Cultura and personally, thank you for your time and your generosity. Thank you.
Appreciate
Thanks
it.
and thanks to Access Cultura for their support of the project. It's meant a lot.
Thanks again. It's been wonderful.
Thank you.